The primary indication of the developing anomaly manifested through the absolute cessation of the ambient background electromagnetic noise that usually permeated the ship's hull, creating a silence so profound it felt as though the universe surrounding the helix had inhaled deeply and indefinitely suspended its respiration. The ship's internal diagnostic systems continued to report nominal values for reactor output and trajectory stability, yet the telemetry data streaming from the navigational star trackers entered into a violent conflict with the observable reality outside the viewports, where the relative distances between star clusters appeared to freeze in static suspension before shifting abruptly in jagged, unnatural jerks. Kram, compressed deep into the pilot's acceleration couch, stared fixedly at the main display with the rigid intensity of a man bracing for an impact he knew he could not evade, finally breaking the oppressive suspension with a voice that grounded against the quiet. "I hate this part, the part where it pretends it's fine." Leah, whose hands hovered tremulously millimeters above the haptic control console, refused to bridge the gap and make contact with the interface, harboring the irrational fear that any physical interaction might be misinterpreted by the surrounding space as a formal ratification of these changes. She forced herself to interpret the erratic telemetry graphs, her whisper cutting through the sterile air. "The knot isn't collapsing outward anymore, it's correcting. It is trying to restore a single present by removing everything that doesn't agree with it." Kram turned his head slowly, the movement fighting the increasing density of the air. "Choosing what?" he asked, though the answer was already evident in the way the constellations were being rewritten. "Choosing which history gets to keep being real," Leah answered, her voice trembling as she acknowledged that their existence was the contradiction being resolved. A soft, melodically polite chime resonated across the bridge, a sound that shared no acoustic DNA with the harsh blare of an emergency klaxon, and on the primary holographic display, a text message materialized, rendered in a typeface of such flawless geometric clarity that it served as immediate proof that the fundamental structure of space-time had assimilated the principles of human user interface design. The message calmly announced, "Correction in progress. Please remain still." Kram stared at the words, disbelief temporarily overriding his fear. Did space just tell us please? Ray's fingers twitched near the manual override, but the notification did not flicker or threaten. It simply existed with the absolute authority of a physical law. The sensation of pressure began to escalate, radiating directly from within the center of the cranium, accompanied by a vibrating resonance that mimicked the grinding friction of tectonic plates shifting deep beneath a planetary crust. The star field beyond the glass underwent a grotesque deformation, folding upon itself with the sharp, creased finality of a sheet of paper being doubled over by an unseen hand. Precisely at the apex of this dimensional crease, a blindingly white, perfect geometric structure began to emerge, its terrifying purity evoking a primal horror because this object was not a space station in any conventional sense, but a materialized function of control. "That's not ARK-9, Kram said, his voice dropping to a hush. Leah's analysis confirmed the worst scenario. "That is what ARK-9 was preventing. We comply, and we get integrated into an acceptable timeline where our memories become noise. We stop being a contradiction." Ray processed the variables, his gaze locked on the unfolding geometry that threatened to sanitize their entire history. "Or," Leah continued, "we reach the core and force a disruption violent enough to interrupt the correction." Ray turned to his crew, the decision crystallizing instantly in the cold light of the folding universe. "We go in," he commanded. Kram leaned forward against the restraints. "Into that?" Ray nodded, initiating the approach vector. "Into ARK-9. If the node is still there, it is our only lever." As the helix engaged its thrusters, a new notification bloomed on the display, authorizing escalation, and the bridge lights dimmed, signaling that reality had shifted from passive observation to active suppression. They did not traverse the distance in any conventional sense governed by Newtonian mechanics or standard propulsion. Rather, they underwent a violent recontextualization of their spatial coordinates, a sensation comparable to being physically dragged through the eye of a needle by a force that viewed biology as a negligible variable. One moment, the helix was drifting in the void, facing the dimensional crease, and in the next consecutive heartbeat, it was already locked into a hard docking coupling, the transition occurring without the sensation of acceleration or the passage of time. The structure that loomed before them in the viewport was a horrifying architectural paradox, an impossible superimposition of multiple conflicting iterations of ARK-9, occupying the exact same physical coordinates simultaneously. The station appeared as a glitch stack, a flickering, unstable amalgamation where sections of pristine, gleaming white hull from a timeline of boundless funding intersected violently with jagged, oxidized skeletal frames from a history where the project had been abandoned to rot for centuries. The visual cortex struggled to resolve the image, perceiving a vibrating, ghostly overlap of metal and vacuum that refused to settle into a singular, definitive shape, causing the entire station to hum with visual static that felt abrasive against the retina. Leah kept her voice rigidly controlled, though her fingers dug into the edge of the console until the knuckles turned white, her mind reeling from the sight of probability manifesting as solid matter. "It's not one station," she whispered, the data on her screen scrolling too fast to be read. "It's a stack of variants. The knot is pulling every version of ARK-9 it can find into a single best fit." Kram stared at the jagged silhouette of the docking ring, which seemed to oscillate between a heavy industrial clamp and a delicate magnetic field, muttering with a mixture of awe and revulsion. "So it's building a compromise out of our nightmares." Ray watched the guidance markers stutter on the HUD, the guidance system screaming warnings about incompatible geometries. "Can we dock?" he asked, his voice cutting through the hypnotic hum of the glitch. Leah's hands flew over the controls, overriding safety protocols that were never designed for quantum superposition. "We can attempt it, but the moment we connect, if the station resolves into a version that doesn't have a port, we will be ripped between versions like wet paper." Ray did not respond to the probability of death. His attention was locked on a tiny, rhythmic pulse of light blinking near the station's midline, close to the shielding of the core housing, flashing in a pattern he recognized from mission logs that, according to official history, were never recorded. "A signature," he said quietly. "Ellen." Kram turned slowly, the blood draining from his face as the implication landed with the weight of a physical blow. "You're saying she's still in there?" "She was there before everything," Ray replied flatly, initiating the final approach sequence manually. The helix nudged forward in microbursts, and the station responded without being asked, alignment rails extending from the hull with surgical precision, treating the docking maneuver not as a mechanical action, but as the fulfillment of a pre-calculated expectation. Metal met metal with a sound that was disturbingly soft, a muffled thud like a lock accepting a well-oiled key, and the airlock cycle began automatically, hissing with pressurized purpose without a single command from Leah. On the helix display, a new message appeared, clean white text centered against the black, welcoming them back and stating that finalization was pending. Kram unbuckled his restraints with frantic, jerky movements. "Smug," he muttered. "It's smug." Leah confirmed that the air composition and temperature were stable, though her sensors were picking up trace amounts of ozone and ionized static. Ray unstrapped first, his movements efficient and stripped of hesitation. "Move fast," he ordered, checking the charge on his rifle. "Do not split up, and do not stop for anything that feels like comfort." Kram grabbed a heavy, compact toolkit and a magnetic tether pack, hefting the wrench as if it were a bludgeon, realizing that in a place where reality was fluid, a physical tool might be more dangerous than an energy weapon. "Fast means what, exactly?" he asked, swinging the pack over his shoulder. "Before we're overwritten," Ray answered, hitting the cycle release. The airlock iris spiraled open, and the corridor of ARK-9 greeted them like a tomb that had never slept, only waited. The panels looked untouched, gleaming with a high-gloss finish, but the air inside felt dry and intensely electrical, tasting of copper and static charge. The lights overhead flickered with a distinct, deliberate delay, illuminating the path a fraction of a second after they stepped forward, creating the unsettling sensation that the hallway was thinking, processing their position before deciding to render the environment. Leah stepped over the threshold and immediately noted the instability of the floor, which seemed to vibrate at a frequency just below the threshold of hearing. "The topology is unstable," she warned, her scanner wand sweeping the walls. "The corridor is trying to become consistent, but it can't decide on a time frame." As they moved forward, the far end of the hallway stretched subtly, the perspective bending to create distance that hadn't existed a moment before, manufacturing time they did not have. Then, at the limit of their vision, where the light dimmed into shadow, the first echo appeared. It was a figure, standing perfectly still in the center of the walkway. It was not a body, nor was it a shadow cast by light. It was a person-shaped absence, a jagged hole in the visual field where the data of a human being had been excised, but the space had not yet closed up. It was a residual, a glitch in the rendering of existence, a version of the crew that had failed to survive a previous iteration. Kram halted, his breath hitching in his throat as the figure tilted its head with a motion that was terrifyingly familiar. "That's a shadow, right?" he asked, his voice cracking. "It's a residual," Leah whispered, looking away, nauseated by the sight of raw causality. "A version that didn't get permission to continue. Don't look at it." The shape remained motionless, yet its very presence radiated a cold, entropic pressure. Ray forced himself not to stare, sensing acknowledgement might give the phenomenon permission to solidify. "Ignore it," Ray commanded. "Keep moving." Behind them, the airlock hissed shut on its own, sealing with a deliberate final click that echoed like a gunshot. A new message bloomed on the wall panel, the liquid crystal display updating with terrifying speed. "Observer motion confirmed. Sanitation deployed." "That sounds bad," Kram said, tightening his grip on the wrench. "It's not a security system," Leah said, her eyes widening as she read the energy spikes. "Then what is it?" Ray asked, raising his weapon. The ceiling panels above them began to separate like skin peeling back from a wound, and blinding light poured out from the interstitial spaces. A swarm of thin, angular shapes descended, the shards. They were not mechanical drones, but geometric constructs of hard light, moving with the sliding, frictionless focus of a calculation resolving itself. They ignored the residual and oriented instantly toward the living observers, their edges humming with destructive potential. "Run," Ray said, low and urgent. The corridor immediately tried to help them, doors sliding open ahead and lights guiding them in the direction the station preferred, not trying to kill them brutally, but shepherding them into compliance with terrifying elegance. "It's opening doors for us," Kram shouted, scrambling for traction on the slick floor. "It's hurting us," Leah yelled, yanking him aside just as a hatch sealed in front of Ray with a soft final click, cutting off their forward path. The corridor forked into 3 identical paths, presenting them with a menu generated by a patient machine.
"Which one?" Kram asked, panic rising. "The one we would never choose," Leah answered, shoving them toward the narrowest, darkest maintenance spur. They took it, diving into the shadows just as the shards reached the fork, paused for a heartbeat like a program waiting for input, then split into 3 streams to pursue all paths simultaneously, erasing the variables and escape.
Their flight from the pursuing geometry channeled them inevitably toward the lab ring, a sector of the station that, in their timeline, had been a blackened husk of thermal damage, but here presented itself with a terrifying, sterile luminosity that stung the eyes. The heavy blast doors slid open with a whisper of pneumatic perfection, inviting them into a circular chamber where the air was scrubbed so clean it tasted of nothing, devoid of the metallic tang of recycled oxygen or the faint comforting scent of machine oil. The room was dominated by a central projection table that hummed with a dormant potential, surrounded by banks of terminals that were dark, not because they were broken, but because they were waiting for authorized input. As the crew breached the perimeter, the room reacted to their biosignatures not with alarm, but with a sudden warm blooming of amber light, softening the harsh edges of the station's architecture and creating an atmosphere of calculated domesticity. The central projector activated without a command, weaving light into matter with a resolution that defied the optical limitations of the human eye, birthing a hologram that was heartbreakingly tangible. It was a sphere, blue and green and swirling with white clouds, rotating with the majestic, slow cadence of a living world. It was Earth. But not the Earth they knew. It was a corrected version, a planet where the scars of the orbital bombardment had been erased, where the coastlines were intact, and where the night side glittered with the continuous, unbroken web of city lights that signaled a civilization that had never fallen. "Ray, come home," a voice spoke, emanating not from a specific speaker, but from the air itself, wrapping around them like a warm blanket. The projection zoomed in, the scale shifting dizzily from planetary to personal, focusing on a sunlit corridor that Ray recognized with a pang of agony that nearly brought him to his knees. A woman stood there, wearing a dress he had only seen in old photographs, her face unlined by radiation or grief. It was Islan. She looked at him, and for a second the recognition was so perfect it overrode his logic, but then the image sharpened further, revealing the flaw. Her eyes were empty, devoid of the chaotic spark of consciousness, resembling the dead pixels of a display that had frozen on the last known good frame. "You are safe," the synthetic Island said, the voice modulating perfectly to match the timbre of her memory while missing the cadence of her soul. "The error is corrected. There is no need to run. It does not hurt to forget." Leah stared at the projection, her mind racing to analyze the data streams hidden within the light. "It's a mask," she snapped, her voice breaking the spell. "Look at the refresh rate. It's a loop. It's not her. It's a lure designed to secure compliance." The shards, which had been pursuing them with lethal intent, now hovered at the chamber's entrance, forming a shimmering curtain of hard light. They did not attack, they waited, their edges softening, pulsing with a patient rhythm, as if to say, "See, we can be reasonable." The system was offering them a choice: accept the lie and be seamlessly integrated into this false paradise, or refuse and be deleted. The psychological pressure was heavier than gravity. The temptation to simply stop, to lay down the burden of survival and accept the simulation, was a physical weight pressing on Ray's chest. "Ray!" Kram yelled, his voice ragged with panic as he saw Ray's weapon lower slightly. "If you freeze, we're done. That thing isn't real." "It offers peace," the voice continued, smooth and relentless. "Why fight for a timeline that is full of pain?" Ray looked at the face of the woman he had crossed time to save, and he saw the lie in the perfection of her skin. "That's not her," he whispered, the grief hardening into cold fury. "Elin wasn't safe. She was brave."
Kram, watching the hesitation, made a sound that was half growl, half sob. "I am done being politely deleted," he roared, charging the central platform with a speed born of pure desperation. He didn't use a code or a hack. He swung the heavy industrial toolkit he had carried from the airlock like a primitive maul, bringing it down with all his strength onto the delicate crystalline lattice of the holographic emitter. The impact was visceral, a sickening crunch of glass and expensive electronics. Sparks erupted in a violent fountain of blue and gold, and the projection of the perfect Earth tore apart, glitching into a chaotic storm of red wireframes and static. The synthetic voice screeched, losing its human modulation and devolving into stream of binary noise. The illusion of safety shattered instantly, and the room snapped back to its cold, hostile reality. The shards at the door turned a violent, angry crimson, their edges sharpening as the protocol shifted from negotiation to purge. "Go!" shouted Ray, shoving Leah toward the maintenance hatch on the far wall. "The tube!" Leah screamed, punching the override. "Lock it behind us!" They dove into the narrow, vertical darkness of the access shaft just as the shards surged forward, slicing through the space where they had stood milliseconds before. Kram slid under the closing blast door, the metal searing his shoulder as a beam of coherent light carved a trench in the deck plate inches from his skull. The hatch slammed shut, sealing with a heavy magnetic thud, but they could hear the high-pitched whine of the drones cutting through the metal on the other side. They were not safe, they were merely falling. The access tube was a throat leading into the bowels of the station, and here the reality distortion was even severe. Gravity did not hold a constant vector. It shifted wildly as the station's internal compensators fought against the rewriting of history. They tumbled, sliding against walls that momentarily became floors, their boots scrabbling for purchase on surfaces that rippled like water. "Grab the rungs," Ray ordered, his voice echoing in the metallic confined space. He caught a ladder rung, the metal vibrating in his grip, and looked down. Below them, the shaft stretched into an infinite, twisting darkness that seemed to defy architectural logic, bending in spirals that shouldn't fit inside the station's hull. The air here was thick with the smell of ozone and burning circuitry. "The station is fighting itself," Leah gasped, hanging from a conduit, her face pale in the emergency lighting. "The core is trying to maintain the original timeline, but the knot is overriding it layer by layer. We're climbing down through a war zone of physics." Above them, the hatch began to glow cherry red as the shards burned through. Molten droplets of durasteel rained down past them, hissing as they cooled in the dark air. "We need to move now," Kram yelled, looking up at the breach. They released their hold and allowed themselves to slide down the central cabling, moving deeper into the chaotic heart of the machine. The descent was a blur of disorientation. Up became down, left became right, and the simple act of falling felt like being tumbled in a dryer filled with rocks. Ray slammed into a bulkhead as gravity rotated 90 degrees without warning, the wind knocked out of him. He scrambled up, finding himself standing on what should have been a vertical wall, looking down across the width of the shaft. The shards poured through the breached hatch above, a swarm of angry hornets made of geometry, adjusting their flight paths instantly to match the shifting gravity. They were not just chasing, they were mapping the chaos, forcing the environment to stabilize into a trap. The shaft suddenly widened into a junction where 3 different service tunnels intersected, but they didn't meet in Euclidean space. They overlapped, flickering in and out of existence. One tunnel looked pristine, another rusted and ancient, the third merely a wireframe outline. The crew landed hard on a grating that groaned under the impact, the vibrations traveling up their legs. Ray looked around, trying to find a path that wasn't dissolving. The sound of the station was deafening here, a cacophony of groaning metal and digital screaming. "Where are we?" Kram asked, wiping blood from a cut on his forehead. "This isn't on the schematics." "We're between versions," Leah said, staring at the flickering tunnel mouths. "The sanitization hasn't finished rendering this level yet." As the shards closed in, illuminating the darkness with their lethal glow, a voice cut through the noise, not the synthetic, polite voice of the station, but a raw, cracked transmission that came from the rusted intercom on the wall, carrying the static of a ghost. "Ray, do not stop!" The sound froze them. It was real. It was her.
The voice that resonated through the jagged, rusted intercom grill was not the smooth, synthesized perfection of the station's interface, but a raw, degraded signal carrying the unmistakable grain of human exhaustion and the crackle of a transmission forcing its way through layers of jamming. Ray froze, his hand hovering over a handhold, the sound of his own name spoken with that specific, painful cadence cutting through the digital noise of the crumbling reality around them. "Elin?" he called out, his voice cracking against the dry air. "Do not stop," the voice replied, coughing slightly, as if the speaker were breathing smoke. "You are running through a system that has already decided you do not belong. Speed will not save you. Disobedience will." Kram scrambled for purchase on a deck plate that was actively trying to reorient beneath his boots, the artificial gravity generators groaning in protest as they struggled to resolve the conflicting data from two different histories. "That would have been nice to hear earlier," he shouted, ducking as a shard slashed through a bundle of cables above his head, showering them in sparks. "There was no earlier," Elin's voice answered, sounding closer now, threaded directly into the comms loop. "There was only this. The calculation is continuous." Leah forced her legs to move, though her muscles burned with lactic acid and terror. She glanced at her wrist comp, which was displaying a frantic cascade of red warnings. "She is right," Leah gasped, vaulting over a shifting bulkhead. "They are mapping us in real time. The station isn't just chasing us, it is predicting us. Every hesitation, every logical turn we make becomes a data point it uses to remove the path ahead." The corridor ahead began to constrict, the walls sliding inward with the crushing inevitability of a trash compactor. The shards did not rush. They simply adjusted their formation, effectively boxing the crew into a trajectory that led straight to a containment field. The logic was flawless. The system knew where they wanted to go, so it was building a cage at the destination. "Then don't hesitate," Elin snapped, her voice sharpening into a command that brooked no argument. "Do something wrong. Break the pattern." Ray looked at the smooth aerodynamic paneling of the corridor, seeing the trap closing. He realized that survival required them to stop acting like soldiers and start acting like vandals. He didn't think. He simply reacted against the grain of his training. He slammed his shoulder into a maintenance panel, shattering the lock, and grabbed the thick, pulsing power conduit, pulsating with the station's lifeblood. He roared with effort and ripped the cable free from its housing. It was not a tactical decision. It was an act of pure, chaotic sabotage. The conduit snapped with the sound of a cracking whip, unleashing a blinding cascade of raw energy and data noise into the corridor. The arc flash was deafening, scorching the walls and filling the air with the acrid stench of ozone and melting insulation. The station recoiled. The walls shuddered violently, not from structural damage, but from the sudden injection of unpredictability into its equation. The shards stuttered in midair, their formation breaking as their target parameters dissolved into static. For a crucial second, the system did not know where the observers were or what they would do next, and the closing trap faltered, the walls halting their crushing advance. "Go!" Ray yelled, throwing the sparking cable at the drones. They burst through the gap in the drone's formation, stumbling into a vertical ventilation shaft that dropped straight toward the core levels. Leah slammed her interface tool into the locking mechanism of the hatch, forcing it to seal with a command that contradicted the station's own security protocols, a command that was half authorized, half corrupt, and entirely unexpected. The hatch froze, undecided between opening and closing, and that indecision bought them the time to slide into the darkness.
It slowed them, Leah gasped, wiping soot from her face as they slid down the ladder. The prediction algorithm crashed. So chaos is the plan, Kram laughed breathlessly, the sound bordering on hysteria. I can do chaos. Ray looked down into the black abyss below, sensing the change in the atmosphere. The air here was colder, heavier, charged with the static of a massive energy source. We are not safe yet, he said quietly. Good. Elan's voice crackled through the walls, sounding grim. Safety is the trap. The sanitization was just the immune response. The correction is coming, and it will try to offer you something you want. Ray felt the truth of that statement settle in his chest like a lead weight. What does it offer? He asked. Elan did not answer immediately, and the silence that stretched between them was more terrifying than the drones. Relief, she finally said, the word heavy with grief. An ending that doesn't hurt. A version of history where you don't have to fight anymore. The shaft opened abruptly into a vast, cavernous space that felt less like a room and more like the interior of a cathedral built by a machine god. They hit the deck hard as gravity snapped back into a stable, crushing alignment. Behind them, the sounds of the shards regrouping echoed down the shaft, slower now, cautious, as if the station had learned that these particular viruses were volatile. The corridor ahead was wide and led directly toward a massive pulsing light. The walls here were not clean white. They were scarred, layered with faint, ghostly afterimages of themselves passing through at slightly different times, leaving trails of motion like a long exposure photograph. My logs are reordering, Leah said, clutching her head as a wave of dizziness hit her. Not deleting, reordering. It's trying to merge our memories with the station's database. Kram wiped blood from his lips, staring at the looming blast doors ahead. So the station doesn't want us dead. It wants us forgettable? Yes. Elan's voice returned, low and relentless, and if you let it finish, you won't even know what you lost. The blast doors ahead began to cycle open, not with a mechanical hiss, but with the deep, resonant thrum of a vault opening. A new message projected itself on the floor, large enough to walk on, clearer and more unavoidable than before. Final resolution imminent. Ray squared his shoulders and pushed forward because stopping would be easier, and easier was exactly what the knot was offering. The corridor bent sharply, revealing the entrance to the core chamber. The space that opened before them was a breathtaking nightmare of impossible geometry. The core did not obey the cardinal directions. It expanded in layers, with massive stabilizing rings suspended in an impossible balance, rotating against one another in directions that refused agreement with the laws of physics. The central stabilizer hung like a held breath, pulsing with a rhythm that felt uncomfortably close to a heartbeat. And there, standing on the outer gantry, silhouetted against the blinding light of the singularity, was a figure. She was not a hologram this time. She was wearing a flight suit that was tattered and gray with dust, her posture slumped with the weight of infinite endurance. She looked like someone who had been holding a heavy door closed for centuries with her bare hands. Ray stopped, his breath catching in his throat as the figure turned slowly to face them.
The core chamber was less a room and more a captive singularity, a space where the architectural logic of the station surrendered completely to the abstract fury of the knot. The stabilizer rings, massive toroids of spun tungsten and field emitters, did not rotate in a vacuum. They ground against the fabric of a reality that was actively resisting their existence, producing a sound that was felt in the marrow of the bone rather than heard, a subsonic vibration of absolute rejection. Elan stood on the walkway, separated from them not by distance, but by definition. She flickered, her image struggling to maintain cohesion against a background that wanted to render her as zero. She looked at Ray, and the exhaustion in her eyes was infinite, the look of someone who had been holding a collapsing sky on her shoulders for an eternity that never officially happened. "Don't come closer," she warned, her voice vibrating with a dual harmonic, human and digital. This place cheats with distance. If you step onto the ring, the system will try to reconcile your timeline with mine, and you will simply cease to exist. Ray stopped, his boots locking onto the grating. Elin, he breathed, the name tasting of ash. I am not the person you came for, Ray, she said, looking down at her own hands, which were phasing in and out of solidity. I am the thing the system couldn't cleanly delete. I am a constraint, a memory leak in the correction algorithm. Leah scanned the readings on her wrist comp, her face pale. She is right. She is pinned to the core logic. If she leaves this room, the correction completes instantly. She is the glitch holding the door open. The console near the edge of the platform flared to life, its surface smooth, black, and terrible. It did not display data streams or diagnostics. It displayed a simple binary prompt in stark white text. Select final state. Kram stared at it, his grip on the wrench tightening until his knuckles cracked. Select final state, he read, his voice dripping with bitter irony. It wants us to choose our own coffin. It's a courtesy, Elin said, her gaze fixed on the stabilizer. The system prefers consent. If you choose a timeline, the calculation is simplified. The energy required to erase the others drops to zero. So we break it, Kram said, gesturing at the spinning rings. Not cleanly, Elin corrected, turning to face them. Clean breaks are variables the system can solve. If you destroy the core, the correction resets. If you submit, it finalizes. You need to create a failure the knot cannot resolve, a non-addressable event, an impossibility. Ray looked at the 3 control junctions situated around the perimeter of the core. How? He asked. Elin pointed to each station in turn. 3 contradictory actions executed simultaneously within the same processor cycle: phase inversion, power disruption, and alignment drift. Leah's eyes widened as she understood the physics of the suicide pact Elin was proposing. You want us to tell the system that the core is on, off, and moving backward all at the same time? Yes, Elin nodded. It will create a logic fault, a moment where the universe doesn't know what is true. In that moment, the authority of the correction collapses. And what happens to us? Kram asked. Elin didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence was the answer. The shards, which had been hesitating at the blast doors, began to advance. They moved slowly, their geometric forms interlocking to form a wall of light, pushing the crew toward the console. The time for debate was gone. Take your stations, Ray ordered, his voice flat. Leah ran to the phase control interface, her fingers flying over the haptic keys to override the safeties. Kram sprinted to the power junction, bracing himself against the conduit housing. Ray took the manual alignment wheel, feeling the torque of the stabilizer fighting him like a living thing. On my mark, Elin said, stepping closer to the central console. Do not hesitate. If one of you is late, the system resolves the error and sanitizes you. The hum of the core rose to a scream. The shards raised their emitters. Now! Elin shouted. Leah slammed the phase inverter. Kram ripped the power couplings free. Ray threw his entire weight against the wheel, forcing the alignment into the red. The result was not an explosion. It was a fracture. The air in the chamber turned into glass, then shattered. The stabilizer rings locked, screaming as physics failed. The console flashed violently, the select final state text tearing itself apart. A synthetic voice boomed, stripped of all politeness. Unresolved state detected. Observer consent required. Choose. 2 holographic buttons materialized in the air above the console, pulsing with hypnotic urgency. One shone with a soothing, soft blue light. Restore. It promised a return to the perfect earth, to a life where none of this had happened, a lie so sweet it made Ray's heart ache. The other burned with a harsh final red. Erase. It offered the peace of oblivion, a clean end to the struggle.
"It's panicking," Leah yelled over the roar of the dying core. "It needs an input to close the loop." Ray looked at the buttons, the temptation to hit restore, to see Elin alive and whole, even in a lie, was a gravity well pulling at his soul. "Ray!" Kram shouted. "Don't do it!" Elin stepped between Ray and the console. She was barely visible now, a storm of white noise in the shape of a woman. She looked at Ray one last time, and for a fleeting second the static cleared, and he saw her, really saw her, not as a soldier or a glitch, but as the person who had waited for him at the end of time. "No," she said, her voice clear and calm amidst the chaos. "There is a third state." She did not reach for the blue button. She did not reach for the red. She raised her hand, which was now blazing with the energy of the collapsing code, and brought it down hard on the empty glass space between the choices. She rejected the binary. She rejected the correction. "Hold the contradiction!" she screamed as her hand connected. The console shattered, not physically, but conceptually. Cracks of blinding white light spiderwebbed out from her palm, infecting the system with her refusal. The prompt dissolved. Elin's body lost its final battle with cohesion, dissolving into streams of pure, luminous data that shot up into the stabilizer rings like a reverse lightning strike. She became the code that broke the machine.
The scream of the dying core did not propagate through the air as a sound wave. It manifested as a violent, instantaneous rewriting of the local laws of physics, a deletion event that struck the observers with the force of a physical blow to the psyche. The station did not explode in a fireball of expanding gas and debris. It began to implode conceptually, folding inward like a complex origami structure being crushed by a fist, the walls losing their definition and reverting to raw, unrendered data. Gravity released its hold on the chamber with a sickening lurch, leaving the crew weightless in a vortex of dissolving metal and blinding light, before snapping back with brutal force from a completely different vector. "Move!" Ray roared, grabbing Kram by the harness and shoving him toward the exit. They scrambled back through corridors that were no longer static hallways, but shifting tunnels of memory and regret. The sanitization protocols had failed, but the collapse of the timeline was far more chaotic. As they ran, the walls flickered, revealing glimpses of other potential histories, versions of the station where they had died upon arrival, versions where they had never launched, versions where they were still frozen in cryosleep. These residuals leaked into the corridor like ghosts, reaching out with translucent hands, whispering fragmented pleas for salvation that were cut short as the geometry sheared them out of existence. One of the apparitions, a version of Kram with his face burned away by radiation, lunged at the real Kram, shouting a warning that was lost in the roar of the collapse. Kram shoved past his own ghost, his eyes wide with the horror of seeing his own potential deaths played out in real time. "Don't look at them!" Leah screamed, her voice tearing at her throat. "They aren't real anymore!" They burst into the airlock ring just as the reality wave began to consume the lab sector behind them. The floor plates were dissolving into wireframe grids beneath their boots, the station literally unmaking itself step by step. The Helix waited at the dock, its airlock beacon pulsing with a frantic green rhythm that seemed like the only anchor in a universe that had lost its mind. Ray threw himself into the pilot's seat, bypassing the pre-flight checks and hammering the emergency separation sequence. The clamps blew with a dull thud, not waiting for the hydraulic cycle to complete, and the ship lurched away from the dying station. The Helix fired its main thrusters at absolute maximum output, the acceleration pinning the crew to their seats with crushing force as they clawed their way out of the gravity well of the singularity. Behind them, the massive, sprawling architecture of ARK-9 did not shatter. It simply ceased to occupy volume. The station folded into a single, infinitely dense point of white light, dragging the surrounding star field with it, bending the light of distant galaxies into a funnel of distortion. Then, with a silence that was louder than any explosion, the point vanished. It didn't fade, it was deleted. The shock wave that hit the Helix was not kinetic, it was existential. It was a wash of redefinition that passed through the hull without resistance, scrambling the sensors, rebooting the neural interfaces, and momentarily erasing the crew's perception of self. For a terrifying second, Ray did not know who he was, where he was, or if he had ever existed. He was simply a consciousness floating in a void of static. Then the reboot completed. The sensation of breath returned to his lungs. The hum of the reactor stabilized. The universe remembered them. Silence returned to the bridge, heavy, absolute, and terrifying. The stars outside the viewport stopped their frantic flickering and settled into a fixed, cold pattern. They looked older, harder, stripped of the soft diffusion of the nebula that had been there before. The instruments flickered back to life, scrolling data streams that made no sense against the previous maps. Leah unbuckled her restraints, her hands shaking so badly she could barely touch the screen. "Report," Ray croaked, his voice sounding rusty as if he hadn't used it in years. "The nut," Leah whispered, staring at the readings. "It's gone. The collapse didn't revert to the primary timeline. It didn't restore the backup." Kram let out a breathless, jagged laugh, staring at his hands as if checking that they were still solid. "We broke it! We actually broke it!" Ray looked down at the planet rotating below them. It was Earth. The continents were there, the oceans were blue, the clouds swirled in familiar patterns. But it was not their Earth. The coastline of Africa was slightly wrong, the polar ice caps were different, and the satellite network that glittered in the darkness was not the wreckage of the old wars, but something new, something active. They had not saved the past. They had crashed into a future that wasn't supposed to exist. They were survivors of a shipwreck on the shore of a reality they had forced into being. "We aren't corrections," Ray said, the realization settling in his chest with the weight of a monolith. The console in front of Leah beeped once, a lonely sound in the quiet bridge. A final message from the system, or perhaps from Ellen's last command, began to type itself out across the black screen. It appeared letter by letter, burning itself into the display with a permanence that signaled the end of the chapter. It was not a warning. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact for the new era they had just violently birthed. The text hung in the air, glowing with a cold, indifferent light, hovering over the image of the strange new Earth that waited for them below. Cycle ended. Spiral begun. Ray leaned back in his chair, watching the words, feeling the ghost of Ellen's hand on his shoulder. They were alive. They were free of the loop. But as they looked at the unknown planet rising to meet them, they knew that the freedom they had won was terrifying. The universe would no longer decide for them. From this moment on, every mistake, every victory, and every tragedy would be theirs and theirs alone. The script was burned. The story was no longer written.